They left her to die in the snow. Then the Iron Duke changed her fate forever. The carriage wheels cracked through the frozen mud, and Elowen Ashcombe was already falling before she understood what was happening. Her father's hand had shoved her shoulder, and the door swung open, and the cold air hit her face like a slap made of ice. She landed hard on the frozen road, her palms scraping against gravel buried under a thin crust of snow. Above her, framed in the carriage window, her mother would not even look down. "Father, please," Elowen called out, her voice cracking as she scrambled to her knees. "I don't understand. What have I done?" Her father, Edmund Ashcombe, did not answer. He simply reached out and pulled the carriage door shut with a force that seemed to end the conversation before it had begun. Through the frosted glass, Elowen could see her sister Beatrice turn her face away, refusing to meet her eyes. "We cannot have a thief under our roof," her father finally said, his voice muffled through the door. "You have shamed this family enough." "I stole nothing," Elowen said, pushing herself to her feet. Her knees were already numb from the cold ground. "You know I stole nothing. Someone else took that necklace, and you know it wasn't me." But the coachman was already snapping the reins, and the horses lurched forward, their breath rising in pale clouds against the darkening sky. Elowen ran a few steps after the carriage, her boots slipping on the icy road, but it was no use. The wheels quickened, throwing up flecks of frozen slush, and within moments the carriage was nothing more than a shrinking shape swallowed by the gray curtain of falling snow. She stood alone in the middle of the road, her chest heaving, her breath coming in short white bursts. The wind picked up, cutting through her thin wool coat as though it were made of nothing at all. She turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of shelter, any hint of a farmhouse or an inn, but there was nothing. Only bare trees standing like black skeletons against the white fields, and the road stretching in both directions until it disappeared into the storm. For a moment she allowed herself to believe they would come back. Surely her father was only trying to frighten her. Surely her mother would insist they turn around, that leaving a daughter on a frozen road in the middle of winter was a punishment far too cruel for a crime she had never committed. She waited, straining her ears for the sound of returning wheels. But there was only the wind, and the soft hiss of snow falling harder now, faster, as though the sky itself had decided to bury her. The truth settled over her slowly, the way cold settles into a body before numbness takes hold. They were not coming back. She thought of the necklace that had gone missing from her mother's dressing table 3 days earlier, an heirloom of sapphire and gold that had belonged to her grandmother. She thought of the way her sister Beatrice's eyes had darted away when their mother demanded to know who had taken it. She thought of how quickly the blame had fallen upon her, the daughter who had never quite fit into her family's plans, the daughter who had refused the marriage they arranged for her the previous spring. It was not difficult to understand now. Beatrice was soon to be married to Lord Callan Whitmore, a man of considerable wealth and even greater pride. A scandal involving a missing heirloom, especially one that could be pinned upon an inconvenient sister, was the perfect solution to a problem that had troubled her parents for months. Elowen had become expendable the moment she refused to marry a man twice her age, simply because his estate bordered their own. Now she understood. She had never been family to them. She had only ever been a burden waiting to be set down. She began to walk, though she did not know in which direction salvation might lie. The road beneath her boots was uneven, patched with ice that threatened to send her sprawling with every other step. The wind screamed through the bare branches overhead, and snow gathered on her eyelashes until she had to blink hard just to see the path ahead of her. Her fingers, already stiff, curled uselessly inside her thin gloves. She pressed her arms tight against her body, trying to conserve whatever warmth remained. But the cold had a way of finding every gap in her clothing, every place where fabric did not quite meet skin. An hour passed, though it felt far longer. The light was fading now, the gray sky deepening toward the black of true night. And still there was no farmhouse, no light in any window, no sound but her own labored breathing, and the crunch of snow beneath her boots. Her legs had begun to shake, not merely from cold but from exhaustion, and twice she stumbled and caught herself against the rough bark of a roadside tree. She thought of her grandmother, the only member of her family who had ever shown her real kindness, who had died 2 winters ago and left behind the very necklace that had become the excuse for Elowen's ruin. She thought of the stories her grandmother used to tell her by the fire, of women who survived impossible things because they refused to lie down and accept the fate others had chosen for them. Elowen tried to hold on to that thought, tried to let it fuel her legs forward, but her body was beginning to betray her. The cold no longer felt like cold. It felt like a heaviness settling into her bones, a strange and terrible calm creeping in behind her eyes. She did not remember deciding to sit down. One moment she was walking, and the next she was on the ground. her back against the trunk of a great bare oak that stood alone at the edge of the road. The snow beneath her did not feel cold anymore. It felt almost soft, almost welcoming, and she found herself thinking that perhaps this was not the worst way for things to end. She thought of Beatrice's face turned away from the carriage window. She thought of her father's voice, flat and final, telling her she had shamed the family. She wondered if they would feel any guilt at all when they returned home and told the servants that Elowen had simply gone away, that she had chosen to leave on her own, a lie so much easier than the truth. Her eyelids grew heavy, and the howling wind began to sound distant, as though it belonged to some other world entirely. Snow gathered on her shoulders, on her lap, on the dark strands of hair that had escaped from beneath her hood. She thought, in some far corner of her fading mind, that she should be afraid, but fear required energy she no longer possessed. Instead, there was only a quiet drifting, a sense of the world growing soft and unfocused at its edges, like a painting left out in the rain. It was the sound of hooves that broke through the haze, though at first she was certain she had imagined it. The rhythm was too steady, too deliberate to be the wind, and it grew louder with each passing second. The crunch of hooves against packed snow, the creak of leather, the low huff of a horse's breath. Elowen tried to lift her head, tried to call out, but her voice came only as the faintest whisper, swallowed instantly by the storm. A shape emerged from the swirling white, tall and dark against the deepening night. A rider on a black horse, moving with the confident bearing of a man who feared nothing the winter could throw at him. The horse tossed its head and slowed, its ears flicking back, sensing something in the shadow of the oak tree that its rider had not yet seen. The rider reined in, his gloved hands steady on the leather straps, and peered into the darkness beneath the bare branches. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind screamed between them, and snow fell in thick curtains, and Elowen felt her consciousness slipping further away, her body no longer entirely her own. She wanted to call out, to raise her hand, to do anything that might draw his attention before the darkness closed over her completely, but her body would not obey. Her vision blurred, the shape of horse and rider dissolving into smears of black and gray, and the last thing she registered before the world went silent was the sound of boots hitting snow, quick and urgent, as the rider swung down from his horse and started toward her. The rider's name was Alaric Thorn, though most who knew him used a different name entirely. One whispered with equal parts fear and respect across the northern counties. They called him the Iron Duke, a title earned not through cruelty but through a discipline so absolute that even his closest allies found him difficult to read. He had commanded soldiers in campaigns that other men spoke of only in hushed tones. He had buried a wife 3 winters past and had not shed a public tear since. His estate, Thornfield Hall, was known for its order, its silence, and the unbending will of the man who ruled it. He had not intended to stop that night. He had been riding hard toward Thornfield after a long and frustrating meeting with a magistrate in the neighboring county, eager to reach the warmth of his own hearth before the storm worsened. But his horse, a stallion named Ferris who had carried him through worse conditions than a winter storm, had balked without warning, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring at something hidden in the shadow of the old oak tree. Alaric had learned long ago never to ignore his horse's instincts. He reined in and peered into the darkness, and for a moment he saw nothing but snow and shadow. Then his eyes adjusted, and he made out the pale curve of a hand against the white ground, half buried already beneath the falling snow. He was off his horse before conscious thought caught up with instinct, his boots sinking into the drifts as he crossed the short distance to the base of the tree. What he found there stopped him cold in a way the winter air had not managed to do. A young woman, her lips tinged blue, her body curled against the trunk as though she had simply given up and let the cold take her where she sat. Snow had gathered in the folds of her coat and in the loose strands of her dark hair. Her eyes were closed, and for one terrible second, Alaric was certain he had found a corpse. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her throat, his own breath held tight in his chest, and felt the faint, stuttering flutter of a pulse beneath her cold skin. She was alive, though barely, and the realization sent a jolt of urgency through him that he had not felt in years. He had seen men suffer the effects of extreme cold on the battlefield, and he knew exactly how little time remained before this stranger's faint pulse would stop altogether. There was no time for questions, no time to wonder who she was or how she had come to be abandoned beneath a tree in the middle of a winter storm. Alaric shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the one lined with fur that had kept him warm through countless northern winters, and wrapped it around her still form. He lifted her from the snow, surprised at how light she felt in his arms, as though the cold had already begun to hollow her out. Her head fell against his shoulder, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts against his neck. He carried her to Ferris, and with the ease of a man who had spent half his life on horseback, He settled her in front of him in the saddle, one arm wrapped securely around her waist to keep her from slipping. The ride back to Thornfield Hall, normally a journey he barely noticed, felt endless. He urged Ferris into a hard gallop despite the treacherous footing, his eyes fixed on the faint lights of the estate as they finally came into view through the swirling snow. The great doors of Thornfield Hall swung open before he had even fully dismounted, alerted by the sound of hooves pounding up the drive. Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper who had served the Thorne family for over 20 years, stood in the doorway with a lamp raised high, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she took in the sight of her employer carrying an unconscious woman through the storm. "Your Grace," she said, hurrying down the steps despite the ice. "What has happened?" "Found her on the road," Alaric said, his voice clipped and urgent as he strode past her into the entrance hall, half frozen beneath the old oak near the eastern bend. "Send for Dr. Hollis immediately, and have Nora prepare the blue room with warm water and every blanket in the house." Mrs. Pratt did not waste time with further questions. She had served the Duke long enough to know that when his voice took on that particular edge of command, obedience was the only reasonable response. She turned and began calling for the other servants, her voice echoing through the marble halls of Thornfield, as Alaric carried the stranger up the wide staircase, her body still limp and unresponsive in his arms. By the time he reached the blue room, a young maid named Nora was already there, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled back the heavy quilts on the bed. Alaric laid the woman down gently, and for the first time since finding her, he allowed himself a moment to truly look at her face. She could not have been more than 20 years old, her features delicate despite the pallor that had crept over her skin, her dark lashes resting against cheeks that had once, he suspected, held a healthier color than the ghostly white they wore now. "Get her out of these wet things," he instructed Nora, stepping back toward the door to allow the maid privacy to work. "Wrap her in dry blankets, and keep the fire built high. I want this room warmer than any other in the house." "Yes, Your Grace," Nora said, already reaching for the buttons of the stranger's soaked coat. Alaric retreated to the hallway, where Mrs. Pratt waited with a look of barely concealed curiosity on her weathered face. In all her years serving Thornfield Hall, she had never once seen the Duke bring a stranger through the front doors, let alone carry one up the stairs with such urgent care. The man was known throughout the county for his coldness, his refusal to entangle himself in the affairs of others, his insistence that charity was best left to those with time to spare for it. And yet here he stood, snow still melting in his dark hair, his usually composed expression tight with something that looked remarkably like concern. "Who is she, Your Grace?" Mrs. Pratt asked carefully. "I don't know," Alaric admitted. "I found her abandoned on the road. No carriage, no companion, nothing to explain how she came to be there. She was nearly gone when I found her." "Abandoned," Mrs. Pratt repeated, her brow furrowing. "In this storm, what manner of person leaves a young woman on an open road?" Alaric had no answer for that. He had turned the question over in his own mind during the ride back to Thornfield, and every possibility he considered left a bitter taste in his mouth. People did not simply wander onto empty roads and collapse from cold without cause. Someone had left her there. Someone had made a deliberate choice to abandon her to the mercy of a winter storm, and the thought settled into his chest like a stone, heavier than he expected for a stranger he had known only these few short hours. Dr. Hollis arrived within the half hour, summoned from his home in the nearby village despite the treacherous roads, and he spent a long while examining the unconscious woman, while Alaric paced the corridor outside her door. It was not like him to pace. He was a man known for his stillness, for the way he could stand motionless through hours of difficult negotiations without so much as shifting his weight. But something about this situation had unsettled the careful order he usually imposed upon himself, and he found he could not sit still while the fate of this stranger remained uncertain. When Dr. Hollis finally emerged, his expression was cautiously optimistic. "She is fortunate, Your Grace, though fortunate may seem an odd word for a woman found half frozen in a storm. Her body temperature is dangerously low, and she shows early signs of cold injury in her fingers, but nothing that appears permanent. Had you found her even an hour later, I fear the outcome would have been quite different." "When will she wake?" Alaric asked. "That, I cannot say with certainty. Her body has endured a significant shock. She may wake within hours, or it may take a day or more. I have instructed Nora to keep her warm and to try small sips of warm broth once she stirs. Beyond that, we can only wait." Alaric nodded, though the answer left him unsatisfied in a way he could not quite name. He thanked the physician and saw him off into the storm with instructions to return the following morning, and then he found himself standing outside the blue room once more, staring at the closed door as though it might yield answers simply through the force of his attention. It was well past midnight when he finally retired to his own chambers. Though sleep did not come easily, he lay awake listening to the wind against the windows, thinking of the stranger's cold fingers, the pale tinge of her lips, the way she had felt almost weightless in his arms, as though the storm had already begun to erase her from the world. He thought of his own wife, 3 winters gone now, and the particular helplessness of watching someone slip away, despite every effort to hold them in place. He had failed to save her. He would not fail this stranger, whoever she was, whatever circumstances had led her to that lonely stretch of road. Morning arrived gray and quiet, the storm finally spent, leaving behind a world blanketed in fresh white silence. Alaric rose before the household had fully stirred and made his way directly to the blue room, where he found Nora seated beside the bed, her needlework abandoned in her lap, her eyes fixed anxiously on the still form beneath the quilts. "Any change?" Alaric asked quietly. "She stirred a little in the night, Your Grace, and I managed to get a bit of broth into her, but she hasn't properly woken. Her color is better, though, much better than yesterday." Alaric moved to the window and looked out over the snow-covered grounds of Thornfield Hall, the field stretching white and undisturbed toward the distant tree line. Somewhere out there, on a road not far from where he now stood, someone had made the choice to leave a young woman in the cold. He found himself gripped by a determination he had not felt in years, a need to understand not only who she was, but who had done this to her, and why. He did not have to wait much longer for his answer. Behind him, a soft, rasping breath broke the silence of the room, followed by the faint rustle of blankets as the stranger began, at last, to wake. Her eyelids fluttered first, slow and heavy, as though even that small movement required more strength than she possessed. Nora leaned forward immediately, murmuring soft reassurances, while Alaric turned from the window to watch. The stranger's eyes opened fully at last, dark and unfocused, drifting across the unfamiliar ceiling, before finally settling with obvious confusion upon the tall figure standing near the window. "Where?" she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper, cracked and dry from disuse. "Where am I?" "You are at Thornfield Hall," Alaric said, stepping closer to the bed, his voice steady despite the strange tightness in his chest. "You were found on the road last night, nearly frozen. You are safe now." The young woman's gaze sharpened slightly, confusion giving way to something more guarded, more wary, as the memories of the previous night seemed to return to her all at once. Her hands curled into the blankets, and her breath caught in a way that suggested tears held carefully in check. "My family," she whispered. "They left me there." Alaric said nothing for a long moment, watching the raw pain move across her face, the humiliation and grief she seemed determined not to fully show him, a stranger in an unfamiliar house. He thought again of the stone that had settled in his chest the night before, and he found it had not lifted at all, but rather grown heavier with the confirmation of what he had already suspected. "Tell me your name," he said finally, his voice gentler than he had intended. She looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing whether she could trust a stranger with even that small piece of herself, before she finally spoke. "Elowen," she said. "Elowen Ashcombe." He inclined his head slightly. "I am Alaric Thorn, Elowen. You are under my protection now, for as long as you require it. No one will send you back out into the cold. You have my word." For the first time since waking, something other than fear crossed her face, a flicker of cautious disbelief, as though kindness were a language she had nearly forgotten how to understand. She did not answer him, but her fingers loosened slightly from the blankets, and Nora, seizing the moment, hurried forward with a cup of warm broth, urging her gently to drink. Alaric stepped back toward the door, giving the 2 women space, but before he left the room he paused and looked back once more at the young woman who had so nearly died beneath a tree in the snow. Whatever had brought her to that road, whatever cruelty her own family had shown her, he found himself resolved to see it answered for. It was not a decision he examined too closely. It simply settled into place within him, as certain and immovable as the stone walls of Thornfield Hall itself. 3 days passed before Elowen found the strength to leave her bed, and in that time, Thornfield Hall became a world unlike any she had known before. The house was vast, its ceilings impossibly high, its halls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, who seemed to watch her every movement with quiet judgment. Yet for all its grandeur, there was a strange emptiness to the place, a silence that seemed to press against the walls, broken only by the crackle of fires and the soft footsteps of servants who spoke in hushed voices whenever they thought she could not hear them. Nora had become something close to a friend during those first days, tending to Elowen with a gentleness that felt entirely unfamiliar after years of coldness from her own family. It was Nora who first told her, in a careful whisper, that the household had never seen the Duke behave as he had the night he brought her home. "He never lets anyone through those doors uninvited," Nora said one afternoon, smoothing the blankets over Elowen's legs as she sat propped against a mountain of pillows. "Not even distant relations. Mrs. Pratt says he hasn't shown a moment's softness since her ladyship passed, bless her soul. And then he comes riding in with you in his arms like the world itself was ending." "Her ladyship?" Elowen asked, curiosity briefly overtaking her own troubles. "His wife," Nora said, lowering her voice further. "Lady Cecilia. She passed 3 winters back, taken by a fever that no doctor could cure. He hasn't been the same man since, or so they say. Cold as the northern wind, some call him. Iron Duke, others say, though never to his face." Elowen absorbed this information quietly, turning it over in her mind as she stared at the dancing flames in the hearth. It explained much about the man who had rescued her. The careful distance he kept even in moments of apparent kindness, the way his dark eyes seemed to hold something guarded and unreachable behind their steady gaze. She wondered, briefly, what kind of woman had managed to soften a man now spoken of only in terms of ice and stone, and what kind of grief had turned him back into someone so thoroughly closed off from the world. By the 4th day, Elowen insisted upon rising from bed despite Nora's protests, restless from days of confinement, and eager to feel useful rather than helpless. Dr. Hollis, upon his final visit, pronounced her recovered enough to move about the house, though he cautioned against overexertion and warned that the lingering effects of the cold might trouble her fingers and toes for weeks to come. It was on this 4th day that Alaric summoned her to his study, a request delivered through Mrs. Pratt with a formality that made Elowen's stomach twist with nerves. She had barely spoken more than a handful of words to the Duke since waking, and the thought of facing him now, expected to explain herself and her circumstances, filled her with a dread she had not felt since the moment her father's carriage disappeared into the storm. The study was every bit as imposing as the rest of Thornfield Hall, lined with towering shelves of leather-bound books, a great oak desk positioned before tall windows that looked out over the snow-covered gardens. Alaric stood near the fireplace when she entered, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He gestured toward a chair across from his desk, and Elowen lowered herself into it carefully, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You are recovering well, I am told," he said, taking his seat behind the desk. "Thanks to your kindness, Your Grace. I owe you my life, and I do not know how I might begin to repay such a debt." "I do not require repayment," Alaric said, his tone brisk, almost dismissive, though something in his eyes suggested he was choosing his words with more care than his voice let on. "What I require is an understanding of the circumstances that led me to find you nearly frozen beneath a tree in the middle of a storm. Tell me what happened." Elowen hesitated, her fingers twisting together in her lap. She had known this conversation would come, had rehearsed various versions of the truth during her long hours of recovery, uncertain how much she wished to reveal to a stranger, however kind he had shown himself to be. But something about the steadiness of his gaze, the quiet patience with which he waited for her answer, made her decide that half-truths would serve neither of them. "My family accused me of theft," she said finally. "A necklace, an heirloom that belonged to my grandmother, went missing from my mother's dressing table 3 days before I was left on that road. I did not take it, Your Grace, though I have no way to prove my innocence. My father declared me a thief and a shame upon the family name, and rather than allow me to remain under his roof, he ordered the carriage stopped on that road and had me put out into the storm." Alaric's expression did not change, but Elowen noticed the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the way his hands, resting on the desk before him, curled slightly into fists before relaxing again. "Your own father did this," he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that suggested the control itself required effort. "My sister is soon to marry a man of considerable standing," Elowen continued, the words coming more easily now that she had begun. "Lord Callan Whitmore. I believe my presence, and the scandal I had already brought upon the family by refusing an arranged match of my own last spring, had become inconvenient. The missing necklace gave them the excuse they needed to be rid of me entirely." "You believe your sister took the necklace herself," Alaric said, watching her closely. "I cannot say for certain," Elowen admitted, "but I saw the way she would not meet my mother's eyes when the question was first raised. I have my suspicions, though suspicion is a poor substitute for proof, and I have no means of obtaining proof from a house that no longer considers me family." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, lost in thought. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight that surprised her. "I do not believe you are a thief, Elowen. I have seen enough liars in my life, men and women both, to recognize the particular quality of truth when it is spoken plainly, without embellishment or excuse. Your account carries that quality. Relief washed over her so suddenly that she felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, tears she blinked back fiercely, unwilling to appear weak before a man who had already seen her at her most vulnerable. "Thank you," she managed. "You do not know what it means to hear those words. After everything. You will remain at Thornfield Hall," Alaric said, his tone shifting back into the brisk efficiency she had come to recognize as his default manner. "For as long as you require. You are under my protection, and no one, not your father, not any member of your family, will remove you from this house against your will. I will not have it said that a guest of mine was cast back out into the cold." Over the following weeks, a strange rhythm settled between them. Elowen, still recovering her full strength, spent her mornings walking the gardens with Nora, learning the layout of the great house, growing accustomed to the particular silence that Thornfield Hall wore like a second skin. Her afternoons, more often than not, found her in the study with Alaric, initially under the pretense of continued questioning about her family's affairs, though the conversations gradually drifted into territory that had little to do with necklaces or inheritances. She learned that he had served in the northern campaigns as a younger man, that the discipline he now wore like armor had been forged on battlefields she could scarcely imagine. She learned that his wife, Lady Cecilia, had loved gardens above all things, and that the very grounds Elowen now walked each morning had been designed according to her vision before the fever took her. She learned, though he never spoke of it directly, that grief had hollowed something out of him that he had not yet found a way to fill. For his part, Alaric found himself increasingly curious about the woman his household had begun calling, half in jest and half in genuine affection, the guest who had come in from the storm. She did not flatter him, as so many who sought his favor were inclined to do. She did not beg for pity, despite circumstances that would have justified a great deal of self-pity in a lesser person. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the resilience he had once admired in his late wife, though the comparison unsettled him enough that he pushed the thought away each time it surfaced. One particularly cold afternoon, as snow fell steadily outside the study windows, Elowen found herself studying the portrait that hung above the fireplace, a painting of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her auburn hair arranged in the fashion of some years past. "Lady Cecilia," Alaric said quietly, noticing the direction of her gaze. "She had that portrait commissioned the year we married." "She was beautiful," Elowen said softly. "She was many things," Alaric replied, his voice carrying a weight of memory. Elowen did not press him to explain. "Kind, in a way I have never quite managed to be. Patient with the tenants, generous with the servants. Thornfield Hall was a different place when she was alive, warmer, somehow, though I could never say exactly how a house made of stone could hold warmth or lose it. Houses hold the character of the people who fill them," Elowen said. "Perhaps it was never the stone that made this place warm, Your Grace. Perhaps it was simply her." Alaric turned to look at her then, something shifting behind his dark eyes, an expression she could not quite name, but which sent an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest, despite the winter cold pressing against the windows. "You speak with a wisdom uncommon for someone who has suffered as much cruelty as you have in recent weeks." "Cruelty teaches quickly," Elowen said, a faint, wry smile touching her lips, despite the heaviness of the subject. "I have learned a great deal in a very short time." It was during these weeks that whispers began circulating through the household staff, whispers Elowen caught only in fragments as she passed through the halls or lingered near open doorways. The servants had noticed the change in their master, the way his usually rigid schedule now bent to accommodate afternoon conversations in the study, the way his cold reserve seemed to thaw, if only slightly, whenever the young woman he had rescued entered a room. Mrs. Pratt, in particular, watched the developing friendship with an expression that mixed cautious hope with genuine concern, unwilling to speak her observations aloud but unable to fully disguise them either. Elowen, for her part, tried not to dwell too deeply on what these changes might mean. She reminded herself, in quiet moments alone in the blue room at night, that she remained a guest in this house, dependent entirely on the goodwill of a man who owed her nothing beyond the mercy he had already shown. She reminded herself that her circumstances remained precarious, that her family's accusations still hung over her name like a shadow she had not yet found a way to dispel. And yet, despite these careful reminders, she found herself looking forward to those afternoon conversations in the study, with an eagerness she could not entirely suppress. Found herself cataloging the rare moments when Alaric's careful composure slipped just enough to reveal glimpses of the man beneath the title of Iron Duke. It was nearly a month after her arrival at Thornfield Hall when word reached the estate that would change the careful balance they had established. News that arrived not through official channels but through the quiet observations of a stable hand who had overheard talk in the village that Elowen Ashcombe's family had begun spreading their own version of events. A story that painted her not as a wronged daughter, but as a dangerous thief who had fled justice, and now, somehow, found refuge under the protection of the Duke of Thornfield. The news struck Elowen like a physical blow when Alaric relayed it to her that evening, summoning her once more to his study, though this time his expression carried none of the careful warmth that had grown between them over the previous weeks. He stood rigid near the fireplace, a letter clutched in one hand, his jaw set in the hard, unyielding line that had earned him his fearsome reputation, before Elowen had come to know the man beneath it. "Your father has been busy," he said without preamble, extending the letter toward her. "It seems word of your presence here has reached beyond the village. This arrived from a contact of mine in the capital, warning me that your family has begun circulating a rather different account of your departure from their household." Elowen's hands trembled as she took the letter, her eyes scanning the elegant script that detailed rumors now spreading through polite society, rumors that painted her as a calculating thief who had stolen a valuable family heirloom and fled before she could be brought to proper justice. Rumors that suggested her survival in the storm had been no accident but rather a carefully staged escape, and that her current residence at Thornfield Hall represented nothing less than a scandal in the making, a duke deceived by a clever criminal who had worked her way into his sympathies. "This is a lie," Elowen said, her voice shaking with a fury she rarely allowed herself to show. "Every word of it is a lie." "I do not doubt you," Alaric said, though the tightness in his voice suggested the news troubled him more than he wished to admit. "But lies, when repeated often enough by people of standing, have a way of becoming truth in the minds of those who hear them. Your father is protecting his family's reputation, and yours has become the convenient sacrifice." Elowen sank into the chair across from his desk, the letter still clutched in her trembling hands, the careful peace she had begun to build at Thornfield Hall suddenly threatened by forces beyond her control. "What am I to do? I have no proof of my innocence, no witnesses to speak on my behalf, nothing but my own word against an entire family determined to see me ruined." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth, his mind clearly working through possibilities she could not yet see. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same steady resolve she had heard the night he first promised her his protection. "Then we shall find proof," he said simply. "I have resources, Elowen, connections that extend well beyond the boundaries of this county. If your sister took that necklace, there will be some trace of it, some evidence that can be uncovered if one knows where to look. I do not intend to stand by while your name is dragged through scandal for a crime you did not commit." Over the following weeks, Alaric threw himself into the investigation with an intensity that surprised even his own household staff, who had grown accustomed to a master whose attention rarely strayed from the practical management of his estate. He dispatched trusted men to make careful inquiries in the village where Elowen's family resided, men skilled in discretion who could gather information without revealing the true purpose of their questions. He wrote letters to acquaintances in the capital, calling in favors accumulated over years of careful political maneuvering, seeking any information that might illuminate the truth behind the missing necklace. Elowen, meanwhile, found herself drawn ever more deeply into the effort, providing what details she could recall from the days before her banishment, the exact circumstances under which the necklace had gone missing, the servants who had access to her mother's chambers, the particular tension that had existed between herself and Beatrice in the weeks leading up to the accusation. Each conversation between them, ostensibly focused on gathering evidence, seemed to deepen the connection that had been quietly growing since the night he first carried her in from the storm. It was during one such conversation, held late one evening as snow fell softly outside the study windows, that Alaric's investigators returned with their first significant discovery. A jeweler in the capital, questioned carefully by one of Alaric's most trusted agents, recalled a young woman matching Beatrice's description, who had visited his shop several weeks prior, seeking to sell a piece of jewelry that closely matched the description of the missing sapphire necklace. She claimed the piece belonged to her personally, an inheritance she wished to convert to funds for her upcoming wedding, Alaric explained, reading from the detailed report his agent had provided. The jeweler, suspicious of the piece's clear age and craftsmanship compared to the young woman's claimed circumstances, declined to purchase it outright, but noted enough details to be certain of the transaction when questioned. "Beatrice," Elowen whispered, the confirmation of her suspicions landing with a weight she had not fully anticipated. Despite everything, some small part of her had hoped she was wrong, had hoped her sister was not truly capable of such a deliberate betrayal. "She sold our grandmother's necklace to fund her wedding, and let our father believe I had stolen it." "It appears so," Alaric said gently, watching the play of emotions across her face with quiet sympathy. Though a single account from a jeweler, however credible, may not be sufficient to fully clear your name in the eyes of society. We will need more than this if we hope to see the truth properly acknowledged. The investigation continued through the following weeks, each new piece of evidence adding to the growing case that would eventually expose the truth of Elowen's innocence. A maid who had served in the Ashcombe household, dismissed shortly after Elowen's banishment under circumstances that now seemed suspicious in retrospect, was located and questioned, revealing that she had witnessed Beatrice slipping into their mother's chambers on the very night the necklace disappeared, though fear of losing her position had kept her silent at the time. Through it all, Elowen found herself growing closer to Alaric in ways that extended well beyond their shared purpose of uncovering the truth. She noticed the way his expression softened when she entered a room, a subtlety she doubted anyone else in the household had detected, given how carefully he guarded his emotions in front of others. She noticed the way he had begun seeking her opinion on matters entirely unrelated to her own circumstances, consulting her on decisions regarding the estate, the tenants, even the management of the very gardens Lady Cecilia had once designed with such care. For his part, Alaric found himself increasingly unable to deny the shift that had taken place within him since the night he found Elowen nearly frozen beneath that lonely oak tree. He had built careful walls around himself since Cecilia's death, convinced that further attachment could only lead to further loss, that the particular agony of grief was not one he wished to risk experiencing again. Yet somehow, without his full awareness or consent, Elowen had begun to find her way past those walls, not through any deliberate effort on her part, but simply through the quiet strength and grace with which she had faced circumstances that would have broken many others. "You do not need to continue this investigation on my behalf," Elowen said one evening, watching him pore over yet another report from his agents in the capital. "You have already given me shelter, protection, more kindness than my own family showed me in 20 years. I do not wish to become a burden upon your resources and your time." Alaric set down the report and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You are not a burden, Elowen. I do not undertake this investigation out of obligation or pity. I undertake it because the truth matters, because you deserve to have your name restored, and because—" He paused, seeming to search for words that did not come easily to a man so unaccustomed to expressing sentiment. "Because I find that your well-being has become important to me, in ways I did not anticipate when I first found you on that road." The admission hung between them, charged with meaning neither had yet dared to fully articulate. Elowen felt heat rise in her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth beside them. "Your Grace," she began, uncertain how to respond to a declaration that seemed to shift the very foundation of their relationship. "Alaric," he corrected softly. "When we are alone, you may call me Alaric." The weeks that followed brought them steadily closer, even as the investigation into her family's deceit continued to build a case that grew more damning with each new piece of evidence uncovered. A second maid confirmed the first's account. A merchant recalled Beatrice inquiring about jewelers who dealt discreetly in unusual pieces. Letters between Beatrice and Lord Callan Whitmore, obtained through means Alaric declined to fully explain, revealed a young woman deeply anxious about funding a wedding that had proven far more costly than her family's finances could easily accommodate, anxious enough to consider desperate measures. By the time spring began to soften the harsh edges of winter, melting the snow that had nearly claimed Elowen's life months before, Alaric possessed enough evidence to expose the truth beyond any reasonable doubt. Yet he found himself hesitant to act immediately, aware that once the truth became public, Elowen's circumstances would shift dramatically, that she would no longer need the shelter of Thornfield Hall, that the careful world they had built together over the winter months might dissolve as quickly as the melting snow outside. It was Elowen herself who finally broached the subject one afternoon, sensing his uncharacteristic hesitation as they walked together through the gardens, the first green shoots of spring pushing up through soil that had been frozen for months. "You have the evidence needed to clear my name," she said quietly. "Why do you delay?" Alaric stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely seen from him. "Because once your name is cleared, you will have no further need to remain at Thornfield Hall. Your family, whatever their crimes against you, will likely seek to reconcile once the truth of Beatrice's deception becomes known, if only to preserve what remains of their reputation. You will have choices available to you that you did not have when I first found you on that road, and I find myself reluctant to see you exercise those choices in a direction that takes you away from here." Elowen's heart pounded in her chest as she absorbed the weight of his words, the careful admission hidden within his characteristic reserve. "And if I told you," she said slowly, "that I have no wish to return to a family who so easily discarded me, regardless of what apologies they might now offer. That whatever choices become available to me, my preference would be to remain exactly where I am. Something shifted in Alaric's dark eyes, a warmth that Elowen had glimpsed only in rare moments over the preceding months now blooming fully into view. Then perhaps, he said, his voice low, we should discuss precisely what form your continued presence at Thornfield Hall might take, once the truth of your innocence has been properly established before the world. The invitation arrived at Thornfield Hall on a bright morning in early spring, sealed with the crest of Lord Callan Whitmore, and addressed with careful formality to His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield. It announced a grand gathering to be held at the Whitmore estate to celebrate the upcoming marriage between Lord Callan and Beatrice Ashcombe, a celebration that would draw much of polite society from across the region, including, the letter noted with evident hope, any guests His Grace might wish to bring. Alaric read the invitation twice before setting it down upon his desk, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across features more accustomed to stern composure than open satisfaction. This, he said to Elowen, who sat across from him reviewing the latest report from his investigators, is precisely the opportunity we require. Elowen looked up, understanding dawning in her eyes as she recognized the significance of what he proposed. You intend to expose the truth there, before all of society, at the very celebration meant to secure Beatrice's future. I intend to see justice served in the manner most likely to ensure it cannot be quietly dismissed or explained away, Alaric said. A private confrontation with your family would allow them the opportunity to construct further lies, to control the narrative in ways that continue to damage your reputation. But before witnesses of standing, at an event meant to celebrate the very deception that ruined you, the truth will carry a weight that cannot be denied or buried. The weeks leading up to the celebration passed in careful preparation. Alaric ensured that every piece of evidence was properly documented, that witnesses were prepared to testify if called upon, that the jeweler from the capital, along with the dismissed maid who had witnessed Beatrice's late-night visit to their mother's chambers, would be present and willing to speak the truth, before an audience that could not simply be paid or intimidated into silence. Elowen, for her part, found herself torn between anticipation and a lingering unease as the day of the celebration approached. Despite everything her family had done, despite the cruelty of being left to die on a frozen road, some small part of her still flinched at the thought of confronting them directly, of standing before her parents and sister and declaring, in front of the very society that had once been her own, the full truth of their betrayal. You need not attend if you find the prospect too difficult, Alaric told her gently, the evening before they were to depart for the Whitmore estate. I can present the evidence on your behalf. You need not stand before them yourself. No, Elowen said, her voice steady despite the nervousness she felt. I have spent too many months allowing others to determine my fate, to speak for me, to decide what I deserved. I wish to stand before them myself, to see their faces when the truth is finally spoken aloud. I owe myself that much, after everything. The Whitmore estate, when they arrived on the evening of the celebration, glittered with the particular brilliance of a society determined to display its wealth and standing to best advantage. Candles blazed in every window, music drifted from the great hall where guests already gathered in their finest attire, and the air carried the mingled scents of perfume and fresh flowers arranged in elaborate displays throughout the grounds. Elowen wore a gown Alaric had commissioned for the occasion, deep blue silk that caught the candlelight in ways that made her look every inch the lady she had always been, despite the months of hardship and doubt that had tested her resolve. She walked beside Alaric through the grand entrance, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and she felt the ripple of recognition and whispered speculation move through the assembled guests as their arrival was announced. Her parents saw her first, across the crowded hall, and Elowen watched the color drain from her mother's face, watched her father's expression shift rapidly from shock to something closer to alarm, as he registered not only his supposedly disgraced daughter's presence, but the identity of the man escorting her. Beatrice, resplendent in a gown clearly chosen to outshine every other woman present, froze mid-conversation with a cluster of admiring guests, her eyes wide with a fear she could not quite disguise. Alaric did not rush the confrontation. He guided Elowen through the crowd with unhurried confidence, accepting greetings from acquaintances with his usual measured courtesy, allowing the tension in the room to build naturally, as more and more guests became aware of the unexpected arrival, and began to whisper among themselves about what it might mean. It was Lord Callan Whitmore himself, eager to maintain the appearance of a gracious host despite his evident confusion, who finally approached them directly. Your Grace, he said, bowing slightly, we are honored by your presence, though I confess some surprise at your choice of company this evening. I thought it fitting, Alaric said, his voice carrying easily across the now quieting hall, that Miss Ashcombe should be present at a celebration meant to honor her family, particularly given the circumstances that led to her absence from society these past months. Edmund Ashcombe pushed forward through the gathering crowd, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and barely controlled anger. "Your Grace, I must ask that you reconsider this display. My daughter's presence here is highly irregular, given the circumstances of her departure from our household." "The circumstances," Alaric repeated, his voice hardening into the tone that had once made grown men flinch on distant battlefields, "are precisely what I have come to discuss, Mr. Ashcombe. Circumstances that involve a missing necklace, a false accusation, and a daughter cast out into a winter storm to die for a crime she did not commit." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests, curiosity and scandal mingling in equal measure as they leaned in to catch every word of the confrontation now unfolding before them. Beatrice had gone pale, her hand gripping Lord Callan's arm with white-knuckled tension, though she said nothing, seemingly frozen by the direction the conversation had taken. "I have no notion what you mean," Edmund said, though his voice carried a defensive edge that betrayed his growing panic. "My daughter was found guilty of theft by her own family, a matter entirely within our own household's purview. Guilty based upon accusation alone, with no proof beyond convenience," Alaric said. "I have spent the past months gathering that proof, Mr. Ashcombe, and I believe your other daughter would find it most illuminating." He gestured, and one of his agents stepped forward from where he had waited discreetly near the edge of the hall, escorting the jeweler from the capital, a respectable-looking man who had agreed, after considerable persuasion and the promise of Alaric's continued patronage, to testify publicly to what he had witnessed. The jeweler's account, delivered clearly and without hesitation, described the young woman who had visited his shop seeking to sell a sapphire necklace of considerable age and value, a description that matched Beatrice with damning precision. The maid followed, her testimony equally damning, describing in careful detail the night she had witnessed Beatrice slip into their mother's chambers, the same night the necklace had disappeared, and her subsequent dismissal from the household when she had attempted, quietly, to raise questions about what she had seen. The hall had fallen entirely silent now, every guest hanging upon each word, watching as Beatrice's careful composure crumbled beneath the weight of evidence too specific, too corroborated, to be easily dismissed as mere speculation or jealousy. Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked toward her parents with an expression of desperate pleading, though neither Edmund nor his wife seemed able to offer any defense against what had just been revealed before their assembled guests. "I needed the funds," Beatrice finally admitted, her voice breaking as the pretense collapsed entirely. "The wedding, the expenses. Father's finances were not what everyone believed them to be, and I could not bear the shame of a cancelled engagement. Elowen had already shamed the family once, by refusing her own match. I thought it would matter less if the blame fell upon her rather than upon me." The admission, spoken aloud before the very society Beatrice had hoped to impress, settled over the hall like a verdict finally rendered after months of uncertainty. Elowen felt something loosen in her chest, a tightness she had carried since that terrible night on the frozen road finally beginning to release, replaced by a quiet, steady vindication that required no further words to feel complete. Lord Callan Whitmore, his own expression a mixture of horror and betrayal, stepped back from Beatrice's side, the engagement that had prompted such desperate deception clearly now in serious jeopardy. Edmund Ashcombe, his face ashen, turned toward Elowen with an expression that seemed to search for words adequate to the moment, though none came readily to a man who had so easily condemned his own daughter to die in the snow. "Elowen," he said finally, his voice hoarse, "I did not know, I would never have, if I had understood the truth of what had happened." "You did not seek the truth, Father," Elowen said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry across the silent hall. "You found it convenient to believe the worst of me, because the worst of me served your purposes far better than the truth ever could have. I do not require your apology now, offered only because the truth has become impossible to deny before an audience of your peers." She turned away from her father then, from her mother's tearful, guilty silence, from Beatrice's desperate sobbing, and found Alaric's steady presence beside her, his hand extending to take her own with a gentleness that spoke more clearly than any words could have of the promise he had made months before, the promise that no one would ever cast her back out into the cold again. They did not remain long at the celebration that had so thoroughly transformed into scandal. As they departed, the assembled guests parted before them with a mixture of awe and lingering shock, whispers already beginning to spread the story that would, within days, travel throughout every corner of society, a story that would restore Elowen's name, even as it destroyed the reputation her family had worked so desperately to protect. The carriage ride back to Thornfield Hall passed in comfortable silence, Elowen's head resting against Alaric's shoulder, as the estate's familiar lights finally came into view against the darkening sky. Spring had fully claimed the grounds now, the gardens Lady Cecilia had once designed blooming with color that had been entirely absent during the harsh winter months. And Elowen found herself thinking, as the carriage rolled up the familiar drive, of how completely her circumstances had transformed since the night she had lain dying beneath a bare oak tree, certain that her story was ending rather than merely beginning. "What happens now?" she asked quietly as they climbed the front steps of Thornfield Hall together. Alaric paused at the top of the stairs, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying none of the careful reserve that had once defined him, replaced instead by an openness that still occasionally surprised even her, after everything they had shared over the preceding months. "Now," he said, "I would ask you to remain here not merely as a guest under my protection, but as mistress of this house, if you would have me. I have spent 3 years believing myself incapable of offering my heart again, certain that the risk of further loss outweighed any possible reward. You have proven me wrong in every possible way, Elowen, not through any deliberate effort on your part, but simply through the remarkable strength and grace with which you have faced circumstances that would have broken almost anyone else." Elowen felt tears gather in her eyes, though these carried none of the pain and despair that had accompanied so many tears shed in recent months. "I came to this house nearly dead, abandoned by everyone I once believed loved me," she said softly. "I never imagined I might leave that road behind so completely, might find not merely safety but genuine happiness within these walls." "Then stay," Alaric said simply. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is where you wish to be." "Yes," Elowen said, her answer carrying the full certainty of everything she had learned about herself, and about him, over the months since that terrible winter night. "Yes, I will stay." The following autumn, Thornfield Hall hosted a wedding that stood in stark contrast to the scandal that had unfolded at the Whitmore estate months before, a celebration marked by genuine joy rather than desperate deception. Mrs. Pratt, Nora, and the entire household staff who had witnessed the remarkable transformation of their once cold and distant master, watched with evident delight as Alaric and Elowen exchanged vows beneath the very oak tree where he had first found her, a tree that now bloomed each spring with a beauty that seemed to honor rather than merely mark the place where her story had so nearly ended. Elowen Thorne, once left to die forgotten in the snow, became mistress of Thornfield Hall not through pity or obligation, but through a love that had grown slowly and steadily from the ashes of her family's betrayal, transforming both her own fate and the heart of a man the world had once known only as the Iron Duke. The ice that had settled over Thornfield Hall since Lady Cecilia's passing had finally, completely thawed, replaced by a warmth that would fill its halls for many years to come.